I have on my phone Google Photos. You guys have Google Photos on your phone? I love Google Photos, and this week in particular, because what it'll do is periodically, it will show me pictures that I've taken in the past. And all week, it's been like popping up these notifications saying, hey, do you remember a year ago? And then show me pictures that I took a year ago. Because a year ago at this time, I, along with about 20 other people here from Ekklesia, were in Israel in the Holy Land. And it has been so much fun looking back a year ago as when we were in Israel, looking at all the pictures on my phone. It was for many of us, I think, what was a once-in-a-lifetime trip. And one of my favorite things that we did in Israel is when we visited the Temple Mount and the Western Wall in Jerusalem. For those of you who don't know the history of Jerusalem, just before the time of Jesus, King Herod at that time did this massive remodel of the Jewish temple. He took Mount Zion and he basically flattened the top of Mount Zion into a large platform that's about 35 acres in size. And on that platform, he doubled the size of the temple as part of this remodel. And we were able to go up onto the Temple Mount. Now, the temple is long gone. The temple was actually destroyed in AD 70, but you can still go to this platform where the temple used to be. But instead of finding a temple up there now, instead what you will find is an absolutely beautiful, a remarkably beautiful Muslim mosque up there on the Temple Mount. And you can go up and visit it like we did. Now, because this is the site of a mosque, when you go up onto the Temple Mount, you climb up this ramp and you get up to the top of it, the women have to wear headscarves over their heads because they're in the presence of the mosque. And the men are not allowed to wear shorts up on the Temple Mount. Well, unfortunately, one of the people who was with us here from Ekklesia, Steve Hayes, you guys know Steve? Anybody know Steve? He forgot that you weren't allowed to wear shorts on the Temple Mount. So he gets up to the top there, and there's literally these armed guards, guys that were like machine guns, stopping him, saying, you can't go in because you're wearing shorts. But the good news is they anticipate stupid tourists, and so they have there a bunch of like headscarves for the women, and for the men, they actually had a skirt. It was this ugly green skirt, and they gave it to Steve, and so Steve puts on this green skirt, and we're wandering around the Temple Mount, taking pictures, looking at all the sights, with Steve wearing this horribly ugly green skirt. I'll never forget that on the Temple Mount. Now, not everybody is allowed on the Temple Mount, even if you have a skirt. If you are a Jew, you're actually prohibited from going onto the Temple Mount. Jews are not allowed up there, primarily because they're afraid of some extremist Jew going up there and trying to blow up the mosque. Because if the mosque is blown up, then that's going to make room for the Jews to be able to rebuild their temple. But as long as that mosque is there, the Jews can't rebuild the temple. And so Jews are not allowed up on top of the Temple Mount. The closest that the Jews can get to the location of the ancient Jewish temple is at the base of the mount. There's a wall called the Western Wall. And so the Jews gather there at the Western Wall because that's the closest that they can get to where the temple was located. And so the Jews gather there and they pray and they worship and they celebrate. It was amazing to see. At the Western Wall, you would have all of these people coming. You'd have young men having their bar mitzvahs there at the Western Wall. You'd see groups of Jews gather together, and they'd form these large circles, and they would sing and they would dance at the Western Wall because here they were at the place of the temple, the place where God's glory was located, and they got to be that close. We also got to take a tour while we were there at the Western Wall of these tunnels that they've done that is dug out from the Western Wall down underneath and alongside the Western Wall. And there's this tunnel as part of this great archaeological project that they're doing to excavate down along the wall to see what they can find down there. And so we went down in this tunnel, and it takes you down there. It's dark, and it's lit, but it's kind of dark and dank, and you're in this tunnel. And as we went through the tunnel, we came to a place in the tunnel where there is this Jewish synagogue underground. And at this Jewish synagogue underground, there were these women who were praying up against the wall, kind of bending forwards, praying. So we asked our tour guide, why is there a synagogue underground in this tunnel? And why are these women praying here? And the answer is that spot where that synagogue was, where those people were praying, that is the closest that the Jews are allowed to the point where the Holy of Holies was in the temple. You see, within the temple, there is a central part of the temple called the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, God's glory was manifest in the Holy of Holies. And so the Jews wanted to be as close as they can to that place where God's presence was located in the temple. And so there they were, deep underground in the Jewish synagogue, praying to the Lord to be close to the glory of God. So today you can still see in Jerusalem that the Jews revere and hold sacred the site of that ancient temple. And in the days of Jesus and the apostles, the Jews also held sacred the temple. And the temple was, because the temple was the place where God's glory was at. The temple was a place where God's presence was manifest amongst his people. And so you can imagine in Jesus' day that any threat against the temple would have been taken very, very seriously. They would not have tolerated anybody who spoke against the temple because that's where the glory of God was at. Well, this morning we are going to look at an early Christian named Stephen. And Stephen is accused of speaking out against the Holy Temple. In fact, he's accused basically of being a potential terrorist who wants to destroy the temple. Already in Acts, we have seen the church face a lot of persecution. In Acts chapter 3 and chapter 4, we saw Peter and John hauled before the authorities and questioned. In Acts chapter 5, we saw that the apostles were flogged. And now the persecution goes up a notch. Because now we're going to see Stephen is falsely accused of blasphemy against the temple. And as a result of that, he is executed for his faith. And Stephen becomes the first martyr of the church. And so this morning, we are going to look at the martyrdom of Stephen. Now, it is rather a long passage. We have to go all the way from chapter 6, verse 8, all the way through chapter 7, and on into chapter 8 today. And so we're going to break it down a little bit. We're going to break it down into 3 sections. And the first section we're going to look at is the charge against Stephen. The charge against Stephen, which is located in Acts 6, 8 through 15. Secondly, we're going to look at Stephen's defense. Stephen's defense is in Acts 7, 1 through 53. So it's a long speech that Stephen gives, 53 verses. In fact, this is the longest sermon in the book of Acts that we're going to look at today. And then third, we're going to look at Stephen's execution. And his execution takes place in Acts chapter 7, verse 54 through chapter 8, verse 3. So the charge against Stephen, Stephen's defense, and Stephen's execution. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. So let's start with the charge against Stephen. Take a look at Acts chapter 6, verse 8. And Stephen, full of grace and power, was doing great wonders and signs among the people. We've already been introduced to Stephen. We saw Stephen in Acts chapter 6, verse 5, listed as one of the first 7 deacons of the church. So he had been called out to help serve within the church as one of the deacons. And as a deacon, he had to be a man of good repute, a man full of the Spirit, a man full of wisdom. And here in verse 8, in addition to that, we learn something more about Stephen. He says he's a man full of grace. He's a man full of power, and he's a man who has performed signs and wonders. This is the first record in the New Testament of someone other than Jesus and the apostles doing signs and wonders. But we also know from Acts 6, verse 1, that Stephen is a Hellenistic Jew. He's a Hellenistic Jew. Well, what does that mean? At this time, there were 2 different groups of Jews within Jerusalem. First of all, you had the native-speaking Jews, those who spoke Aramaic. They had grown up in Israel. They had grown up in that land, and so they were native-speaking, or what Paul calls himself, a Hebrew of Hebrews. But then there was this other group of Jews who had immigrated to the Holy Land. They didn't grow up there. They had been in other parts of the Roman Empire. They were Jewish ethnically, but they didn't speak the native Aramaic language. Instead, they spoke Greek as their primary language. And so these Greek-speaking Jews, or as they're called in this passage, Hellenistic Jews, immigrated to Israel because they were devout Jews who wanted to be closer to the temple, because the temple is where the presence of God was located. So they had moved to Jerusalem to be closer to God. And Stephen and the 6 other deacons came from these Hellenistic Jews. But it was also from these Hellenistic Jews that Stephen found his opposition. Take a look, starting in verse 9. It says, "Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, and of the Syrians and of the Alexandrians, and those from Cilicia and Asia, rose up and disputed with Stephen. But they could not withstand the wisdom and the spirit with which he was speaking." Now, the Bible itself doesn't tell us much about this synagogue of the freedmen, but scholars have been able to piece together from archaeology and from history something about this particular synagogue. This is the synagogue of the freedmen because about a few decades before, when Rome captured Jerusalem originally, they took as captives some of the Jewish soldiers. And they hauled them away and they dispersed throughout the Roman Empire. And there, when they had children, those children did not speak the native Aramaic. They were speaking Greek from that particular territory. And eventually, the Romans released them as slaves, and they became freedmen. And some of them came back to Jerusalem, and they founded this synagogue of the freedmen. And this synagogue was devoted to those who were pilgrims, Hellenistic Jews, coming to Jerusalem to see the temple. And so they would teach them about the Torah there, and they would also give them food and water and lodging there at the synagogue of the freedmen when they came. So why is that important? Because that means when Stephen is talking here in this synagogue, he is speaking to Hellenistic Jews who have traveled thousands of miles for one purpose. They've come to Jerusalem to visit the temple, because there in the temple is where they would find the presence of God. And so Stephen, a Hellenistic Jew himself, finds himself in the synagogue in a debate with these Hellenistic Jews. And let's see what their accusation against him is. Starting in verse 11, it says, "Then they secretly instigated men who said, 'We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God.' And they stirred up the people and the elders and the scribes, and they came upon him and seized him and brought him before the council. And they set up false witnesses who said, 'This man never ceases to speak words against this holy place and the law. For we have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us.'" So what's the charge against Stephen? The charge is of blasphemy, that he is speaking against two sacred things that they hold dear. First of all, that he's speaking against the holy place. That is the temple. He was speaking against the temple. But secondly, he was speaking against Moses and the law of Moses. They said of Stephen, "We've heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and will change the customs that Moses delivered to us." In other words, they're accusing Stephen of being a potential terrorist who wants to destroy the temple and then change the law of Moses as a result. Now, why would they make this kind of accusation? Why would they think that Stephen wants to destroy the temple? Why do they think that he's a terrorist? Well, Luke makes it very clear that this is a false charge. But there is some basis for this accusation. You see, Jesus did talk about the destruction of the temple. In Mark chapter 13, Jesus and the disciples had been visiting the temple. And as they are looking around at the temple and the beauty of the temple, one of his disciples says, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And Jesus goes on then in Mark chapter 13 to talk about the destruction of the temple, to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem, and to ultimately the signs of his return. Jesus is predicting here the coming destruction of the temple and the coming destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Romans in AD 70. And in AD 70, that's exactly what happens. The Romans come in and they destroy the temple and they destroy the city of Jerusalem. And Jesus is predicting that clear back in Mark chapter 13. And it's very likely that as Stephen was talking to these Jews in the synagogue about Jesus' prediction, that somehow they had twisted Jesus' words into thinking that Jesus himself was going to cause that destruction. So they twisted his words in order to make it sound like he was a terrorist. Secondly, Jesus also spoke out about the law of Moses. In Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law." Jesus then goes on in Matthew 5 to completely change their thinking about the law, as he tells them that keeping the law is a matter of the heart. It's not a matter of the external. And so as Stephen is teaching them about what Jesus said about the law, to them it sounds like he's going to completely change the law of Moses. So Jesus did talk about the temple. Jesus did talk about the law. And these Hellenistic Jews manipulated and twisted the words of Jesus as Stephen taught them to make them sound blasphemous so that they could haul Stephen before the Jewish council. And so Stephen is hauled before the Jewish council. And in chapter 7, verse 1, the high priest asks him, "Are these things true?" And so for the next 53 verses in Acts chapter 7, Stephen is going to defend himself. So let's take a look at the defense of Stephen here in these 53 verses. And we're going to break down Stephen's defense by looking at his response to the two charges. We're going to first look at his defense against the charge of blasphemy against the temple, And then we're going to look at his response to his charge of blasphemy against Moses and the law. So let's start by looking at Stephen's response to the charge of blasphemy against the temple. But before we do that, we need a little background on the temple itself. The temple, as we talked about, was remodeled by King Herod around 19 BC. And it took Herod about 46 years to complete that remodeling effort. And the temple that he created was incredibly beautiful. It was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. According to the historian Josephus, the temple was overlaid in white marble and in certain places was plated in gold, such that when people would look up onto the Temple Mount, it was said that it gleamed like a snow-covered mountain. It was incredibly beautiful. But it was not just the physical beauty of the temple that the Jews treasured, because the temple itself was important to the Jews for one particular reason, because God dwelt inside the temple. And the very center of the temple was a room called the Holy of Holies. Inside the Holy of Holies is where they kept the Ark of the Covenant. But more importantly, it was inside the Holy of Holies that God's glory was present. The very presence of God existed inside those Holy of Holies. Now, there's reason for belief in that. Because you see, this temple that Herod was rebuilding was actually not the original temple. It's actually the second temple. And the original temple was built 1,000 years before, in 950 BC, by another king, a king by the name of Solomon. And in 1 Kings 8, we see a record of him building the temple. And after that original temple was built in 950 BC, they held a dedication service. All of Israel came to Jerusalem, and they gathered, and Solomon dedicated the temple unto the Lord. And at the conclusion of that dedication service, something remarkable happens. In 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 10, it says this: "When the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord." After Solomon dedicated the temple, a cloud came, filled the temple, and in particular filled the Holy of Holies, so that God's glory and God's presence shone itself uniquely within the temple. But what Stephen is going to show as he goes through chapter 7 here is that God's presence, while certainly in the Holy of Holies, God's presence has never been confined to just the temple. That God's presence has never been confined to a physical place. And what Stephen is going to do is he's going to take his accusers through 4 events in the Old Testament to show that God has revealed his glory not just in the temple, but God has revealed his glory in many places and to many different people, not just the temple. And the first event that Stephen uses to prove his point is the story of Abraham in Acts chapter 7, verse 2. It says, "And Stephen said, 'Brothers and fathers, hear me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, and said to him, Go out from your land and from your kindred and go into the land that I will show you.'" Stephen is saying long before there was a temple, and thousands of miles from where the temple would be built, God revealed his glory to Abraham in Mesopotamia, and he told him to move to the promised land. The second event that Stephen uses to prove his point is the story of Joseph. We pick that up in chapter 7, verse 9. "And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. But God was with him, and he rescued him out of all of his afflictions and gave him favor and wisdom before Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, who made him a ruler over Egypt and over all of his household." Even though Joseph's brothers had sold him into slavery into Egypt, God remained with Joseph in Egypt. God was not confined to a temple. Joseph was far from where the temple would be built, and yet God was with him there in Egypt. And he confirmed his presence with Joseph by rescuing the family of Israel from famine. The third event that Stephen uses to prove his story is the story of Moses. We pick that up in chapter 7, verse 30. It says, "Now when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him," meaning Moses, "in the wilderness of Mount Sinai, in a flame of fire in a bush. When Moses saw it, he was amazed at the sight. And as he drew near to look, there came the voice of the Lord. 'I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and of Isaac and of Jacob.' And Moses trembled and did not dare to look. Then the Lord said to him, Take off the sandals from your feet, from the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their groaning, and I have come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send you to Egypt." God meets Moses, and he shows his presence to him, not at a temple, but at a burning bush in the middle of a wilderness. And God says, this is holy ground. And this ground is holy, not because there's anything special about that particular piece of desert, not because there's anything particularly special about that bush, but it's holy ground. Why? Because God is there. The glory of God is there, and that's what makes the ground holy. What Stephen is saying is, what makes something holy is the presence of God. The temple is not inherently holy. There's nothing particularly holy or special about the Temple Mount. What makes the Temple Mount holy is that God's glory is there. There's nothing particularly special about this dirt here in the wilderness where the bush is burning. What makes it holy is that God's glory is there. So God, in his presence, is what makes a place holy. A place is not inherently holy. And God met Moses, not at the temple, but at a burning bush in Mount Sinai. But not just at a burning bush in Sinai, he's also present with his people back in Egypt. It says here, "I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their moaning, and I have come down to deliver them." God is not stuck in a temple. He's not stuck in a building. God is wherever his people are. That God is not tied to a place, but God is tied to his people. And he is with his people in Egypt, and he is coming down to Egypt, and he will deliver them. The fourth event, then, that Stephen uses to prove his point is the very construction of the temple originally by Solomon. Let's pick it up in verse 47. "But it was Solomon who built a house for him." We just talked about that. "Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands. As the prophet says, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all of these things?" Stephen here is quoting from the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 66. And what's his point? Yes, God's glory was inside the temple, but the temple was never to be considered the literal home of God, because the temple is too small. God is too big to be contained within a building. He says even the entire universe cannot contain the presence of God, let alone some building in Jerusalem. And even King Solomon knew that, because at the dedication service to the temple, Solomon says this in 1 Kings 8:27. Solomon said, "Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built?" Even Solomon, the original builder of the temple, knew this fact, that God is everywhere present. God is living and he's active. God is not confined to a building. God is not confined to a temple. And the real Holy of Holies is not so much a building where the temple is located, but it's wherever God has revealed himself to his people. And so Stephen has defended himself against the charge of blasphemy against the temple by saying the temple is not the only place where you see God's glory. God's glory was revealed to Abraham in Mesopotamia. It was revealed to Joseph in Egypt. It was revealed to Moses in a burning bush. It was revealed to the people of Israel during the time of the Exodus. And yes, God was there when the original temple was built, but even Solomon said, this temple can't contain the glory of God. And so, Stephen is not guilty of the charge of blasphemy against the temple. But there's a second charge as well. And that's the charge of blasphemy against Moses and the law. And Stephen is going to respond to this second charge very differently. He's going to go on the offense by doing this. And he turns the tables and he says, if you want to talk about disrespect for Moses and you want to talk about disrespect for the law, let's take a quick look at the history of Israel and see how Israel does when it comes to respecting Moses and the law. Because the people of Israel disrespected Moses so much that they were refusing to accept Moses as their leader. Take a look at Acts chapter 7, starting in verse 23. It says, when he was 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brothers, the children of Israel, speaking of Moses. And seeing one of them being wronged, he defended the oppressed man, and he avenged him by striking down the Egyptian. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand. but they did not understand. And on the following day, he appeared to them as they were quarreling and tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you wrong each other?" But the man who was wronging his neighbor thrust him aside, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us? Do you want to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" And at this retort, Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became a father of 2 sons. See, Israel failed to see that God had sent Moses to be their Savior. God sent Moses to be their deliverer, and they did not recognize him as their deliverer, and they pushed him aside, and they rejected him. Does that sound familiar at all? Isn't that exactly what the Jewish council did to Jesus as well? That God sent Jesus to be their Savior, and what did the Jewish council do? They didn't recognize it, and they pushed him aside. And that's exactly Stephen's point, starting in verse 35. Verse 35 says, "This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, 'Who made you a ruler and a judge?' This man God sent as both the ruler and the redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, 'God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers.'" Here in verse 37, Stephen is quoting from Deuteronomy 18:18. Where Moses said that someday God was going to send another one like him. God was going to send the Messiah. God was going to send Jesus, and he is going to be like me. He's going to show signs and wonders. He's going to lead you, and he's going to redeem you, and he's going to save you. And what Stephen is saying here is that because they rejected Jesus, and because Jesus came as one like Moses, what that means is that same Jewish council who rejected Jesus, if they had been back in the time of Moses, they would have rejected Moses as well. And so it is not he who is guilty of blasphemy against Moses. It is they who are guilty of blasphemy against Moses, as evidenced by the fact that they rejected Jesus. Not only did Israel disrespect Moses, but they also disrespected the law that Moses brought from God. Take a look at verse 38. This is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our fathers. He received living oracles to give to us. Our fathers refused to obey him, and he thrust them aside, and in their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron, "Make for us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses, who led us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." And they made a calf in those days, and they offered a sacrifice to the idol, and they were rejoicing in the works of their hands. Stephen says, you want to talk about disrespect for the law of Moses? Let's talk about the golden calf. How respectful of the law were the people of Israel when they were worshiping the golden calf? That's where real blasphemy is. And then Stephen goes in for the final blow, starting in verse 51. Stephen says, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in your hearts and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." In these 3 verses, Stephen gives 4 highly inflammatory accusations against his accusers. First, he calls his accusers a stiff-necked people. This speaks to their stubbornness. And this word, stiff-necked people, is used as a term for the Israelites in Exodus 33 and 34 when they were worshiping the golden calf. After they had worshiped the golden calf, God came down and said, "You people are a stiff-necked people." And now Stephen is calling them a stiff-necked people as well. Why? Because when they worshiped the golden calf, what they were doing is they were worshiping something they had made with their own hands. And now they had put the temple into such high regard that the temple itself had become an idol for them, something that they had built with their own hands, and they were proud of the temple, not what the temple represented, but the temple itself became an idol for them. And so he says, you are a stiff-necked people, just like the people of Israel who worship the golden calf. Secondly, Stephen calls his accusers uncircumcised in heart and ears. Stephen is saying, your private parts may be circumcised, but you're not circumcised where it counts, in your hearts and in your ears. That is, you may have the external trappings of a relationship with God, but you won't let the law of God come into your ears, and you certainly have not accepted God within your heart. Third, Stephen calls his accusers murderers of the righteous one. Remember, this very same Jewish council that he's standing in front of right now, this is the same council that just a short time ago had condemned Jesus to death. And they had, just like the Israelites of old, had rejected all of the prophets. So now they had rejected Jesus as their deliverer, betraying and murdering him and killing him on a cross. Fourth, Stephen calls his accusers blasphemers of the law. They have been blessed to receive the very law of God, but they did not keep it. Stephen's point in all four of these accusations is to show that their mistreatment of Jesus was in itself a form of blasphemy against Moses and the law. But not only was their mistreatment a form of blasphemy against Moses and the law, but their mistreatment of Jesus was also a form of blasphemy against the temple as well. Why do I say that? Listen as I try to explain this to you. Turn to John chapter 2. John chapter 2, verse 18. In John chapter 2, Jesus is visiting the temple. And when he comes to the temple, he encounters a bunch of money changers in the outer courtyard of the temple. And these money changers are making a profit off of the worshipers who have come to worship God in the temple. And this angers Jesus. And so he makes a whip, and he starts whipping around, driving the money changers out of the temple in anger. And after he's done this, we pick it up in verse 18. It says, "So the Jews said to him, 'What sign do you show us for doing these things?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up.' The Jews then said, 'It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?' But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken." Jesus here is comparing his body to the temple. And he says, if you destroy this body, my temple, then in 3 days it'll rise again, which is exactly what happened when he rose from the dead. But I want you to capture this. Jesus compares his body to the temple. He says, my body is the temple. It is a new temple. And this is not the last time Jesus says this. He says this throughout the Gospels. In fact, in Matthew 12:6, Jesus says, referring to himself, "I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." Jesus says, referring to himself, "I am greater than the temple." Why would Jesus compare his body to the temple? And why does he think that his body, as the temple, is greater than this beautiful building on the Temple Mount that took 46 years to construct? The answer to this is found a chapter earlier in John chapter 1, verse 14. In John chapter 1, verse 14. See, Jesus is claiming to be the fulfillment of the temple. Remember, the temple is the place where God's glory came down and filled up the Holy of Holies, which means God's presence was amongst the people of God there in the temple. But now in Jesus, God's glory has come down and also dwells within the people, within himself. Jesus is saying, I am the presence of God in your midst. John 1:14 says it this way, speaking of Jesus, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Skip down to verse 17. "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known." Jesus is the living, breathing temple of God. In Jesus, we see God in the flesh. In Jesus, we see God living among us. And if in Jesus, we are able to see God himself. Because as it says in Colossians 1:19, in him the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Stephen's opponents were looking to find God in the wrong place. They were looking to the temple, hoping that they could be close to the presence of God in the temple. They were looking to the law, thinking that by keeping the law, they could be close to God. But they missed that God was close to them. God was already in their presence in the very person of Jesus. And the same can be true for us. we often are looking for God in the wrong places. And we construct our own temples. And we go seeking after God by going to certain places or going to certain times, hoping that God will be more present there and that we can find God in a place or in a time. And in so doing, we are missing seeing that God has already come and has been present with us in the person of Jesus Christ. And so we'll come to church on a Sunday morning, thinking that if we come to church, we'll find the presence of God here. Or we'll go to community group or college group. Maybe we'll get baptized. And all of that is an attempt to seek God's experience and seek God out. Maybe we go on a retreat or we go to a worship night, hoping that we'll finally experience the presence of God. But people, God's glory doesn't work that way. God's glory is in the person of Jesus. So if you know Jesus, if you are in Christ, then you have the presence of God with you at all times. You have the glory of God inside you at all times. We don't have to go looking for the glory of God. We don't have to call upon God to make His presence known. His presence is here in us. We have the glory of God in us wherever we go. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 3:16, don't you know that you are God's temple and God's Spirit dwells in you? People, we don't need to go to Jerusalem. We don't need to go to the Western Wall to be close to the presence of God. We don't have to come to church on Sunday to find God's glory. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't come to church on Sunday morning, but let us not fool ourselves into thinking that somehow God is more present here because we sing really cool worship songs, because the lights are low, as if we could conjure up the Holy Spirit through our singing and our prayers. Instead, we need to realize that for those of us who are in Christ, we have already received the Holy Spirit. We don't have to ask for the Holy Spirit. He is already here. We don't have to ask for God's presence. His presence is already here. We have the presence of God within us wherever we are, if we are in Christ. However, if you're not in Christ, if you don't have Jesus, then there is no place you can go to find the presence of God outside of Christ. There is no spiritual activity you can do to be closer to God outside of Christ. It doesn't matter where you are. You could be at the very holy of holies in the temple, and if you don't have Christ, you will not experience the glory of God. Because it is Jesus Christ alone who is the image of the invisible God. It is Jesus Christ alone who has made the Father known. Jesus himself said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And so if you want to experience the glory of God, if you want to experience the presence of God, the answer is simple. Come to Jesus. Come to Jesus. If you want to experience the presence of God, come to Him, know Him, believe in Him, accept Him, and then, and only then, will you find the glory and the presence of God made real in your life. We find the presence and the glory of God in Jesus. So we've seen the charge against Stephen in Acts chapter 6, and we've seen Stephen's defense in Acts chapter 7. Now we're going to pick it up in Acts 7:54, and we're going to see the execution of Stephen. Now when they heard these things, they were enraged, and they ground their teeth at him. But he, full of the Holy Spirit, gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. And he said, Behold, I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and rushed together at him. Then they cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. And as they were stoning Stephen, he called out, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. In the midst of Stephen's brutal murder, he says 3 final words, which are deliberate parallels between his death and the death of Jesus. First, Stephen says, I see the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. I love this because he is experiencing the presence of Jesus. He's experiencing the presence of God in his death, and he sees Jesus. But it also reminds us in Mark 14:62 of when Jesus stood trial before this same Jewish council. The high priest asked Jesus, Are you the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus responded, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. And now Jesus is standing before the same court, and he sees Jesus at the right hand of power. I see him there. Secondly, Stephen says, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. In Luke 23:46, just before Jesus died, Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And finally, Stephen says, Lord, do not hold this sin against them, reminding us in Luke 23:34, when Jesus prayed for those who crucified him, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. In his death, Stephen is identifying with the death of his Lord and Savior. He is sharing in the suffering of Christ. He is becoming like Christ in his death because he knows that by sharing in the death of Christ, he will also share in the resurrection of Christ. And so Stephen dies identified with Christ. After recording Stephen's death, the author of Luke here gives us an epilogue, starting in chapter 8, verse 1. It says, And Saul approved of his execution. And there arose on that day a great persecution against the church in Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. Devout men buried Stephen and made great lamentation over him. But Saul was ravaging the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. There are two concluding comments that Luke gives us about the martyrdom of Stephen. First of all, the martyrdom of Stephen profoundly influences a guy by the name of Saul. The execution of Stephen gives him a renewed zeal to persecute the church, and we're going to see that more fully when we get to chapter 9 of Acts. But in chapter 9 of Acts, we also see that Saul becomes the fulfillment of Stephen's prayer. Because Stephen said, forgive those who are stoning me. And Saul was one of those. And Saul will find that forgiveness at his conversion in Acts chapter 9. Secondly, though, the martyrdom of Stephen profoundly shocks the church. The church has been now persecuted, and it requires them to flee Jerusalem, and they have to scatter into the neighboring regions of Judea and Samaria. Remember back when we started our sermon series in Acts chapter 1, we looked at Acts 1:8. And in Acts 1:8, Jesus tells his disciples, you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Well, for the first 7 chapters of the book of Acts, the church has done a pretty good job of being a witness in Jerusalem. But they've pretty much been confined there. They have not extended out into Judea and Samaria, let alone the rest of the world. And God is now going to use the shock of Stephen's execution to push the church beyond the boundaries of Jerusalem. And starting in chapter 8, we're going to see the gospel witness move out to Judea and Samaria. And then in chapter 10, we're going to see the gospel move out to the ends of the earth. And as they do so, Stephen's message here to the Jewish council is going to be a word of comfort to the church. Because as they scatter, God is going to be with them wherever they go. The church should not fear scattering out of Jerusalem and into Judea and Samaria, because as Stephen reminds us, God is not found in the temple in Jerusalem, but God is with us wherever we go. God is not tied to a place, God is tied to his people. So as the church begins to scatter from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, they can be assured of the presence of God, even as they leave from underneath the shadow of the temple. In conclusion, turn to Matthew chapter 28. Matthew 28. Matthew 28 is a parallel passage to Acts chapter 1, recording the final mission of the church as given by Jesus. And just as in Acts 1:8, Jesus tells his disciples to be a witness to the entire world, in Matthew 28, Jesus tells his disciples to make disciples of all the nations. Look what it says, starting in verse 19. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And behold, what does he say? I am with you always, to the end of the age. You see how Jesus ends his commission? He says, as you go out to make disciples, as you scatter from Jerusalem into Judea and into Samaria and to the ends of the earth, he says, I am with you the whole way. Ekklesia, Jesus has called us to be on mission. We are to make disciples. We are to be his witness in our city, in our region, in our country, and in the world. And here's the good news. As we go out, as we are scattered from this place, as we go into our communities, as we go out into the world, even if it be clear across the world, we have this promise that Jesus is with us as we go about his mission. God is no more here at Cal Young Middle School on a Sunday morning than he is with you when you are at home or when you are at work or when you are at school. Jesus is with his church wherever he goes. And so you can have the confidence as you are bearing witness to him in the community that Jesus is walking with you. Because God does not dwell in a temple. God is not contained in the building. God is not tied to a place. God is tied to his people. And we are his people. We are the church. And we are the church when we gather. So when we gather, God is here, present with us. But we are also the church when we scatter, meaning that God is with us when we scatter as well. And so my encouragement for you this morning is, let's be the church. Let's be the church when we gather, and let's be the church when we scatter to be a witness to Christ to this world. And we can be bold and courageous and bearing witness to the testimony of Jesus no matter where we go, because Jesus gave this promise: I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Let's pray.